Segment 1. The death of absolute power. The death of Joseph Stalin didn't produce a successor, it produced fear. For decades, power had been centralized into a single point of control, reinforced through purges, surveillance, and calculated terror. When that point vanished in March 1953, the system didn't smoothly transition, it destabilized. The Soviet Union wasn't designed to outlive its dictator, it was designed to be him. In the immediate aftermath, the highest ranking figures didn't complete openly. Correction. In the immediate aftermath, the highest ranking figures did not compete openly. They concealed ambition behind cooperation, forming what appeared to be a collective leadership. This was not stability, it was hesitation. Each man understood the rules of Stalin's world. Power is taken, not inherited. Hesitation invites elimination. The structure of governance remained intact, but the psychological center of authority had collapsed. Georgy Malenkov assumed the formal role of premier, positioning himself as the administrative successor. Simultaneously, Lavrenti Beria, the architect of internal repression, controlled the security apparatus, the only real instrument of enforcement. In parallel, Nikita Khrushchev quietly expanded influence within the Communist Party, which ultimately controlled appointments, ideology, and legitimacy. This triad didn't represent balance, it represented mutual suspicion. Malenkov had positioned without enforcement, Beria had enforcement without trust. Khrushchev had neither visible dominance nor immediate threat, but he possessed access to the party machinery, the slowest but most decisive instrument of power accumulation. The critical mistake of this phase was structural, not personal. The Soviet system relied on centralized coercion to maintain coherence. Once fear receded, fragmentation became inevitable. Beria attempted to consolidate control rapidly, leveraging the security services to expand influence. This triggered the predictable response, preemptive elimination. Within months, he was arrested and executed by his own colleagues, not because he was weak, but because he was too dangerous to be allowed time. What followed was not resolution but redistribution. The most aggressive actor had been removed, leaving behind a vacuum that could not remain unfilled. Malenkov's authority eroded under pressure, while Khrushchev continued operating beneath the surface, consolidating alliances, positioning himself as the least threatening option, until he was no longer the least powerful. The death of Stalin didn't end authoritarian control, it removed the most efficient executor and exposed the fragility of system built on fear. The next phase would not be about survival, it would be about control without terror, a contradiction that would define everything that followed. Segment 2. The Rise of Khrushchev. The Rise of Khrushchev. Control without terror. The removal of Beria didn't stabilize the system. It removed the fastest path to dictatorship. What remained was a slower, more calculated competition, one that rewarded patience over brutality. In this environment, Nikita Khrushchev emerged not as the strongest, but as the most adaptable. Khrushchev didn't seize power through force, he constructed it. He leveraged the Communist Party, an institution often underestimated compared to the military or secret police. As the primary instrument, control over appointments, promotions, and ideological alignment allowed him to build a network of loyalty that did not rely on fear but on dependency. This was a time, this was a different model of power, less visible but more sustainable in a post Stalin environment. His decisive move came in 1956 with the secret speech, where he denounced Joseph Stalin and exposed the crimes of the previous regime. This was not moral courage, it was strategic repositioning. By dismantling Stalin's legacy, Khrushchev removed the ideological foundation of his rivals, many of whom had built their authority under Stalin's shadow. He refamed the past to control the future. This strategy created immediate consequences. The Soviet Union began a process known as de-Stalinization, reducing the whole of terror in governance. Political prisoners were released, censorship relaxed marginally, and a limited form of internal debate was permitted. However, this created a contradiction. The system had been designed to friction under repression. Moving repression exposed inefficiencies, dissent, and structural weaknesses. Externally, Khrushchev projected volatility rather than stability. His confrontations with the United States, including the Cuban Missile Crisis, demonstrated a willingness to escalate risk, but was also but also revealed limits when confronted with potential systematic destruction. He oscillated between aggression and retreat, creating an image of unpredictability rather than dominance. Domestically, his economic policies failed to deliver consistent results. Agricultural reforms, particularly the Virgin Lands Campaign, produced temporary gains followed by long term inefficiencies. Industrial output stagnated relative to Western economies. The gap between ideological claims and material reality widened, reducing internal credibility. The critical failure of Khrushchev was not incompetence, it was inconsistency. He attempted to maintain centralized control while loosening the mechanism that enforced it. He sought reform without redesigning the system. This produced instability rather than renewal. In 1964, the elite reached a conclusion. Khrushchev was no longer useful. Unlike Stalin, he had not constructed a system of fear that could protect him. Unlike Beria, he didn't control the instruments of coercion. He was removed through an internal party coup, quite procedural and final. Khrushchev proved that power could be taken without terror. But he also proved that without fear, it could also be taken away just as easily. Segment 3, Brezhnev, Stability as Low Decay. The removal of Nikita Khrushchev didn't protect reform, it produced caution. The system had just experienced volatility. The elite recalibrated toward predictability. Into this environment stepped Leonid Brezhnev, a figure whose defining trait was not brilliance or force but reliability. Brezhnev didn't attempt to redesign the Soviet system, he froze it. His leadership prioritized consensus within the Politburo, reducing internal conflict and eliminating erratic policy swings that defined Khrushchev's era. This created the appearance of stability, decision making slowed. Dissent was managed quietly, the machinery of state continued to function without visible rupture. This wasn't strength, it was controlled stagnation. Economically, the Soviet Union under Brezhnev maintained output through scale rather than efficiency. Heavy industry remained dominant. Military spending continued at high levels, and consumer sectors were neglected. The system avoided collapse by sustaining existing structures, but it failed to innovate. Productivity gains flattered. Productivity gains flattened, and the technological gap with the West widened. The economy was not failing visibly, it was failing structurally. Politically, Brezhnev reinforced centralized authority without returning to Stalinist terror. Surveillance remained, dissent was suppressed, and repression was selective rather than total. This created a population that was not terrified but disengaged. The state retained control but lost ideological momentum. Compliance replaced belief. Externally, the Soviet Union projected power through military presence and geopolitical influence. The doctrine that later came to be associated with Brezhnev justified intervention to maintain control over satellite states. This preserved the empire in the short term but increased long term costs. Maintaining dominance required continuous resource allocation, further straining an already inefficient economy. The critical dynamic of this period was inertia. The leadership aged, decision making slowed further, the system became resistant to change. Brezhnev's extended tenure ensured that no significant restructuring occurred. By the late 1970s, the Soviet Union was locked into a model that could neither adapt nor collapse rapidly. This is where most simplified narratives fail. Brezhnev did not weaken the Soviet Union through sudden failure. He ensured that it would weaken gradually, invincibly, and irreversibly. By prioritizing stability over transformation, he eliminated the possibility of recovery. When Brezhnev died in 1982, he left behind a system that appeared intact but had lost its capability to evolve. The next leaders wouldn't, wouldn't inherit a functioning state. They would inherit a structure that could only be maintained temporarily, not dismantled. Segment 4, Terminal Phase, Leadership Without Time. When Leonid Brezhnev died, the system didn't reset. It revealed the most critical weakness. It had no mechanism for renewal. What followed was not leadership transition, but leadership exhaustion. Yuri Andropov, a former KGB chief, understood the depth of the problem. Unlike his predecessor, 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 he recognized that the system wasn't merely inefficient, it was deteriorating. He initiated limited reforms targeting corruption, absenteeism, and bureaucratic inertia. This was a brief attempt to impose discipline on a structure that had grown complacent under Brezhnev. Under Andropov, but Andropov didn't have time. His health was failing when he took power, and his tenure lasted barely over a year. His reforms were too narrow, too late, too dependent on his political authority. Once he weakened physically, the system reverted immediately. The apparatus he tried to correct simply outlasted him. His successor, Konstantin Chernenko, represented the opposite trajectory. When Andropov attempted intervention, Chernenko embodied inertia. Under physically debilitated at the time of his appointment, he lacked both the capacity and the intention to implement change. His leadership was administrative continuation without strategic direction. This period is often dismissed under his brevity. That was a mistake. This was a phase where the Soviet Union crossed from decline to inevitability. The rapid succession of aging leaders exposed the internal paralysis of the system. It demonstrated that power was no longer concentrated in individuals capable of decisive action, but in a structure that is selected continuity over competence. The elite made a critical calculation during this period. They had observed three outcomes in sequence: stagnation under Brezhnev, failed intervention under Andropov, and complete passivity under Chernenko. The conclusion was unavoidable. Incremental adjustments would not preserve the system. Maintaining the status quo would accelerate collapse. The problem was no longer whether change was necessary. The problem was that any meaningful change could destabilize the system further. Leadership had reached a structural trap. Reform would weaken control, but lack of reform would ensure decay. The elite made a critical calculation during this period. They had observed three outcomes in sequence: stagnation under Brezhnev, failed intervention under Andropov, and complete passivity under Chernenko. My conclusion, the conclusion was unavoidable. Incremental adjustments wouldn't preserve the system. Maintaining the status quo would accelerate collapse. The problem was no longer whether change was necessary. The problem was that meaningful change would destabilize the system further. The leadership had reached a structural trap. Reform would weaken control, but lack of reform would ensure decay. By 1985, the Soviet Union required a leader who could attempt systematic transformation, not preservation. This requirement didn't emerge from vision or ambition, it emerged from the absence of alternative. When Mikhail Gorbachev was elevated to power, he wasn't selected because he was the safest option. He was selected because the system had exhausted all safer ones. Gorbachev reform that triggered collapse. When Mikhail Gorbachev assumed power in 1985, he inherited a system that could no longer be sustained through inertia. Unlike his predecessors, he didn't attempt to preserve the structure in the existing form. He attempted to transform it. The decision didn't create instability, it accelerated it beyond control. Gorbachev introduced glasnost, a policy that reduced censorship and allowed public criticism, and perestroika, an attempt to restructure the Soviet economy by introducing limited decentralization and market like mechanisms. These reforms were not radical by external standards, but within the Soviet framework they were disruptive. The system had relied on information control and centralized planning. Weakening both simultaneously removed the mechanisms that maintained coherence. The immediate effect was exposure. Economic inefficiencies had not been hidden, became visible. Corruption previously managed internally became public knowledge. Nationalist movements within Soviet Republic, long suppressed, gained momentum. The population didn't suddenly become dissatisfied. It has always been. The difference was that dissatisfaction could now be expressed, organized, and amplified. Externally, Gorbachev altered Soviet strategy by reducing confrontation within the United States and withdrawing support for maintaining strict control over Eastern Europe. This removed the geopolitical buffer that they had defined Soviet influence since the end of the Second World War. Eastern European states began to exit Soviet alignment without military resistance. The cost of maintaining empire was reduced, but so was the perception of Soviet power. Internally, the reforms created a structural contradiction. Economic decentralization required local initiative and flexibility, while the political system remained partially centralized. This produced fragmentation without coordination. Enterprise gained limited autonomy but lacked market discipline. The state reduced control but didn't establish effective alternatives. The result was declining output, supply disruption, increasing economic instability. The critical failure was sequencing. Gorbachev weakened political control before stabilizing economic reform. This allowed political actors, both within the Communist Party and in emerging opposition movements, to exploit instability. The power shifted away from the center faster than new structures could be established. This environment enabled figures like Boris Yeltsin to emerge not as external challenges but as internal rivals who leveraged the new political openness to build independent power bases. Authority was no longer monopolized, it was contested. By 1991, the system had reached its limit. A failed coup attempt by hardliners demonstrated that even those attempting to restore control lacked the capacity to do so. The central authority fractured completely. The Soviet Union formally dissolved. Gorbachev didn't dismantle the Soviet Union through intention. He removed the constraints that had previously prevent its collapse. The structure failed because it couldn't function without losing constraints. Segment 6, Yeltsin to Putin: Collapse, Chaos and Decentralization. When the Soviet Union dissolved in 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev didn't hand over a functioning state. He handed over a vacuum. Into that vacuum stepped Boris Yeltsin, not as a successor within the Soviet system, but as a leader of a fundamentally different entity, the Russian Federation. Yeltsin's period was not a continuation, it was a rupture. The centralized command economy was dismantled rapidly through privatization and market reforms. This process didn't produce efficiency, it produced extraction. State assets were transferred into private hands at speed, creating a class of oligarchs who accumulated wealth through access rather than productivity. The state lost control over economic levers, while institutions capable of regulating the transition remained underdeveloped. The political environment mirrored the economic one. Authority was fragmented, regional leaders asserted autonomy, central control weakened, and the government struggled to enforce coherence across the federation. The 1990s were defined by instability, not transition. Inflation surged, living standards collapsed for large segments of the population, and the legitimacy of the new system remained contested. Yeltsin reliance on executive power on managed crises further eroded institutional stability. The 1993 constitutional crisis, where military force was used against the parliament, demonstrated that the new system was not resolved by the fundamental issue of authority. It had merely relocated it. Power was no longer ideological, it remained centralized when necessary and absent when not. By the end of the decade, the pattern was clear. The Soviet model had collapsed under rigidity. The post Soviet model was failing under fragmentation. The system required consolidation, not experimentation. This requirement produced Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin. Putin's rise wasn't accidental, it was a response of systematic demand. It was a response to systematic demand. His strategy was direct: restore central authority, reassert state control over key economic sectors, and eliminate independent power centers that could challenge the state. Unlike his predecessors, unlike his predecessors, he didn't attempt ideological transformations or rapid economic redesigning. He focused on control. Under Putin, the state reabsorbed influence over strategic industries, particularly energy. Regional autonomy was reduced and political opposition was constrained. The chaotic pluralism of the 1990s was replaced with managed stability. This stability wasn't neutral. It was constructed through deliberate concentration of power. The contrast between Yeltsin and Putin defines the final phase of this sequence. Yeltsin represented uncontrolled decentralization. Putin represents controlled centralization. Both are reactions to the same underlying problem. the need to maintain state coherence in the absence of a stable system. The full arc from Joseph Stalin to Vladimir Putin is not a story of linear leadership succession. It is a cycle. Absolute control under Stalin produced fear-based stability. That stability decayed into stagnation under Leonid Brezhnev. Attempts to reform under Gorbachev triggered collapse. Fragmentation under Yeltsin created disorder. Consolidation under Putin restored control. The system didn't evolve, it oscillated between extremes. The pattern remains unresolved.